Throughout human history, one single, incredibly seductive idea has caused massive, often catastrophic systemic shifts. It's the concept of absolute equality. The idea that everyone should live the exact same way, have the exact same resources, and no one should ever be allowed to climb higher than the rest. Now, on paper, this looks noble, right? To argue against it almost feels wrong. But according to some of the most prominent economic frameworks of the 20th century, human biology and economic laws frankly do not care about our romantic ideals. History has taught us a brutal lesson. Attempting to build a society based on forced equality of outcome almost always collapses into chaos and poverty. Today we're going to explore exactly why these sources argue that happens.
Welcome to This Explainer. We are going to look at the world's most famous institutional frameworks through the lens of human motivation. By utilizing the economic and philosophical ideas of Daron Acemoglu, Friedrich Hayek, and Arthur Laffer, we are going to unpack a truly mind-bending paradox. We'll explore the argument that fighting for absolute equality can actually, accidentally, create a trap that destroys a society from within.
Let's dive right into Section 1, the extractive trap.
To understand why systems fail, these economists argue we first have to look at the extremes. So let's start with what Acemoglu and Robinson call extractive institutions. Picture a society where the rules of the game, the political power, and all the resources are locked inside a closed loop. They exist solely to serve a tiny elite at the top, and the social elevator for everyone else is completely broken. Imagine you're an ordinary worker in this system. You sweat, you skip sleep, you build something incredible. But the very moment you succeed, a corrupt system swoops in and confiscates your wealth. Are you going to have any incentive to build a second business? Absolutely not. Human beings run on one core psychological engine: incentives. If your brain realizes that extra effort doesn't equal a better life, it instantly shifts into energy-saving mode.
Now, Acemoglu and Robinson contrast this directly with inclusive institutions. Inclusive systems are the exact opposite. They secure property rights, encourage mass participation, and create a genuinely level playing field. They foster innovation because they actually incentivize you to invest in your future. But under extractive institutions, those economic drivers just die. People stop inventing, they stop taking risks, and they do only the bare minimum to survive. The elite actively block any sort of creative destruction because new technologies threaten their monopoly on power. And the ultimate result, the authors warn, is eventual chaos that just explodes from below.
The Soviet Union is a brilliant historical example of this. Between 1928 and 1960, the USSR actually grew at around 6% annually. But this was essentially just catch-up growth. They achieved it by forcibly reallocating resources from subsistence farming directly into industrial production. But they entirely lacked the inclusive institutions needed for sustained long-term growth. There were zero incentives to innovate because experimentation is inherently risky. If you failed, you missed your top-down production targets. In fact, managers were actively incentivized to undershoot their targets so their future quotas would remain low. It just goes to show, you simply cannot artificially mandate creative destruction.
Which brings us to Section 2, the equality trap. Horrified by the brutal realities of those extractive elites, historical leaders have sometimes swung the pendulum to the exact opposite pole, trying to force absolute equality from the top down. Never again, they say, let's make everyone perfectly equal. But Nobel laureate Friedrich Hayek warned back in 1944 that this noble goal creates an accidental road straight to totalitarianism. His logic flows like this: centralized economic planning is inherently value-laden. Because different people naturally have different priorities, central planners eventually have to impose their specific values on everyone else. To enforce that, you need coercion and the suppression of dissent, which ultimately results in complete authoritarian control over both economic and political life.
Hayek argued that dictating economic outcomes completely destroys the impersonal, objective forces of the free market, that invisible hand that naturally balances what people actually want. Remove that, and you're replacing it with human bureaucrats. And we all know the famous Lord Acton quote Hayek cited: "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." A system that was originally meant to equalize everyone inevitably ends up concentrating absolute power into the hands of just a few central planners.
Let's move on to Section 3, the Laffer paradox.
In modern democracies, to try and engineer this kind of equality without slipping into overt totalitarianism, states often rely on extreme progressive taxation. But in 1974, economist Arthur Laffer pointed out a fundamental, undeniable truth about this. A 0% tax rate yields zero government revenue, right? But so does a 100% tax rate. Why? because at 100% nobody is going to bother working. Therefore, there has to be a peak on this curve, where raising taxes any further actually destroys the incentive to work, invest, and innovate, which ultimately leads to a massive decrease in overall state revenue.
As you can imagine, this leads to some pretty intense academic debates. Some economists, relying on static mathematical formulas, have theorized that the optimal top tax rate to redistribute wealth is somewhere between 73 and 83%. They calculate this assuming that the people producing the wealth will just keep producing it at the exact same rate, totally ignoring the massive tax penalty. But other experts push back hard. They point out that this entirely ignores the dynamic destruction of human capital. It ignores the long-term, real-world choices people make about getting an education, starting a business, or simply deciding whether or not to work those extra hours.
And this is where we find a genuinely brutal psychological overlap. Think about that visionary innovator, the one who stays awake for 3 days straight to build a global company. If they know the state is going to take 83 or 90% of their reward to distribute it equally to everyone else, what happens to their brain? The exact same thing that happened to the worker in the corrupt extractive dictatorship. Mathematically speaking, whether an extractive dictator confiscates your wealth by force or a staggering tax rate redistributes it by law, the incentive to innovate dies in the exact same way.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 4, the reality of capital flight.
So what actually happens out there in the real world when a state pushes taxes way past that Laffer peak? Well, in 2012, France imposed a massive 75% super tax on incomes over 1 million euros. They projected it would bring in 420 million euros a year, but instead, it collected only 260 million in year 1 and a dismal 160 million in year 2. It triggered massive capital flight. High-profile individuals, like the famous actor Gerard Depardieu, literally packed their bags and moved to Belgium. He took his acting talents and his massive taxable income right along with him. The policy was such a failure, it had to be quietly repealed by 2015.
And hey, it is definitely not just a European phenomenon. $68 billion. According to IRS data from 2020 to 2021, U.S. urban counties lost $68 billion in taxable income purely from net migration. The truth is, high earners are incredibly sensitive to tax penalties. When you punish success in the name of equality, the drivers of society simply stop driving. Or they just take their massive economic engines to an entirely different jurisdiction.
Let's wrap things up with Section 5, the illusion of control.
This all brings us to the core flaw in trying to perfectly engineer society from the top down, the illusion of control. Static economic models tend to assume that human beings are just immovable constants on a spreadsheet. But researchers point out that to truly forecast prosperity, we have to use dynamic scoring. We have to account for real human behavioral responses and the global mobility of capital in a totally borderless world. Ignoring the peak of the Laffer curve doesn't just fail to raise money, it actively bleeds the state of the very revenue it desperately needs to fund basic services.
Which leaves us with a truly profound paradox to consider today. Inclusive institutions absolutely thrive on a level playing field, offering opportunity to everyone. But if we try to aggressively, artificially engineer absolute equality of outcome, literally punishing every peak just to fill every valley, do we end up destroying the very incentives that create prosperity in the first place? Do we risk paving our own road to serfdom? It is a remarkably fine line between creating opportunity and completely destroying human motivation. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I'll see you in the next one.